Hello, class. We just covered Freud's theory of personality and how the major driving force for all human beings was sex for the most part, and personality development was a function of this desire for pleasure, desire for sexual gratification. All right, so the major human motivation for Freud, again, was sex and a little bit of that death instinct, although Freud really only talked about that near the end of his life. So now what we're going to go and do is we're going to try to cover a few of the other psychodynamic approaches to personality fairly quickly, highlighting some certain points of their theories. But again, we could spend an entire class on this sort of stuff, so we're going to go pretty quickly through these, or somewhat quickly through these, and hit the high points of some of these theories. I want you to be able to compare and contrast some of these theories and discuss what's the major cause of human motivation, what's the major motivating force for human beings according to all of these different theorists. Also, I want you to notice, again, the similarities between the biography of these individuals, the experiences that they had as children, as young adults, and the theories that they propose about human nature, the theories that they propose all human beings struggle with this one or this other issue. All right. So first, let's go to Carl Jung. Now notice I said Carl Jung and not Carl Jung. Jung is an incorrect pronunciation, and people will look at you weirdly if you pronounce it like that. So you could use the more German Jung or Jung. Either one of those, people won't look at you that funny. Carl Jung grew up in Switzerland. His father was a clergyman, but his father wasn't very religious. His father went through the motions of religion, but he really didn't have faith in his religion. He was into the church, but really didn't have a personal relationship with God. And so this is going to impact Carl Jung, where he sees the trappings of religion, but without that spiritual personal connection to God, and he's going to react against this. So he's going to be not for organized religion. He's going to be a very spiritual person, and his theory, we can describe it as being very mystical. Sigmund Freud was an atheist. He looked at things through the eyes of Darwin's theory of natural selection, for instance, the pleasure principle, and with the libido. Carl Jung is going to be more mystical, more spiritual, more religious in his motivations compared to Sigmund Freud. So Jung's father was a clergyman who had lost his faith. His mother had a wide variety of emotional disorders. His mother was not very loving to him. His mother did not treat him very well. So guess what? According to Sigmund Freud's theory of personality, all human beings need to have a close relationship with their mother. That's very important, or otherwise you are SOL and your personality is going to be horrible. You're not going to be able to develop as a capable human being. But for Carl Jung, who doesn't have a very close relationship with his mother, it's not very necessary in Carl Jung's theory. Carl Jung was not a very social child. His parents did not necessarily like him that much. They did not love him in the ways that Freud's parents loved him. Carl Jung was picked on by his fellow school children. After grade school, he decided he wanted to become a physician. Sound familiar? Similar to Freud here. So he ends up getting his medical degree, but he starts reading some things about Sigmund Freud and thinks it's pretty interesting. So he goes and decides to be a follower of Sigmund Freud's and to adopt Sigmund Freud's theory about mental illness and so forth. So they become close buddies. Jung becomes one of Freud's mentees. Freud is the mentor of Carl Jung. And Freud likes him so much that he taps him to be his successor. So the next head of the Psychiatric Society, the International Psychiatric Society, is going to be Carl Jung. But some people don't like this. Freud had a very specific reason why he tapped Carl Jung. Carl Jung, not Jewish. Sigmund Freud was Jewish. A lot of the individuals that practiced psychoanalysis were Jewish. And there was, at this period of time, a lot of anti-Semitism, especially in the academic disciplines for professors, for scientists. Very hard to get a job if you were Jewish or if you had a Jewish sounding last name. So to give psychoanalysis some legitimacy, Freud wanted to tap Carl Jung, a non-Jew, and have him be the next leader of psychoanalysis. This ends up not happening because Carl Jung ends up revolting against Freud and argues that a lot of Freud's theories are not exactly correct and goes off in a very different way. So Jung eventually rebelled against Freud. And right around the age of 40, Carl Jung has what we might refer to as a midlife crisis. Well, 38, I was close. He suffers a midlife crisis. He doesn't know what he wants to do with his life, and he rediscovers who he is as a person. And based off of this midlife crisis, he ends up developing his own theory of personality, his own theory of the treatment of mental disorders. But again, we're only going to talk about personality here. Remember Freud, all of personality development really takes place in the first few years of life, between the ages of 1 and 8. 1 in 10, something like that. And if your parents do a good job of raising you, you have the right experiences, you're going to develop to be a good human being. If you don't have the right experiences, you're going to develop to be a bad human being. Notice that for Carl Jung, his personality really didn't stop developing in his own eyes until way after that period of time, right? He had a midlife crisis. So for Carl Jung, all human beings are going to continuously change. Their personality is going to keep developing as they age. Very different from Sigmund Freud. Carl Jung was not just interested in things psychology or things that were medical. He's also interested in a wide variety of spiritual things. He's interested in religion. He's interested in mythology. He's interested in anthropology, and the influences of all of these we can see evidence in his theories, in his ideas about personality. And in fact, nowadays, Carl Jung's work is probably more well known in mythology and religion and maybe anthropology than it is in psychology. Another thing to mention about Carl Jung is that his theory of personality has changed over time, which makes describing his theory very difficult. It's very hard to pin down. And if you don't understand it, that's fine. Or if you don't understand it in its entirety, that's fine, because I'm pretty sure Carl Jung didn't understand the entirety of his theory as well. So some of this is going to be weird, even weirder than what Freud was talking about, and that's fine. But we're going to talk about some highlights of his theories and his lines of thinking, because again, they have had some influence. So Freud, remember, there was the consciousness, there was the preconscious, and there was the unconsciousness. And the magic was happening in the unconscious. The majority of mental processes were occurring unconsciously. We do not know what's truly going on in the unconscious, according to Sigmund Freud. Now, for Carl Jung, he argues that there's 2 levels of unconscious. There's the personal unconscious, which is similar to Freud's regular unconscious. So this is the reservoir of material that we have suppressed, maybe repressed, maybe have forgotten, that we don't have access to. Similar, again, to Freud. And then there's also this deeper level. So like the movie Inception, if you've seen that movie where you can look at a dream within a dream, this is the next level to the unconscious. It's the unconscious part of the unconscious. This is the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is the deepest level of the psyche, and we all share the same collective unconscious. You, me, everybody, all of our unconsciouses are connected together in some way. The collective unconscious are the memories and the experiences of our ancestors, of our parents' parents, of some pre-human species. So we have all of the memories of everybody that has related to us. Well, not everybody related to us. If we're looking at a direct line, our parents, parents, and so forth, going all the way back to when human beings were primates. Well, we're still primates. When we were non-human primates. There we go. When we were an Australopithecus or something along those lines. All right. So this is kind of weird. And also notice this is not how memory works. You don't have your father's memories because your father impregnated your mother and then that led to you. Memories don't work that way. But again, Carl Jung thinks they do. So what's evidence of the collective unconscious? So Carl Jung points to mythology and a lot of shared human experiences that we have with one another in different societies that are independent of one another. So a good example of this, dragons. All right, so here we have in Western cultures here we have in Western cultures the idea of a dragon. Here we have in Eastern cultures the idea of a dragon. Now, these arose independent of one another. So Eastern and Western cultures developed the idea of a dragon independently of one another. According to Carl Jung, this was not just due to random chance. There's a reason for this. In our collective unconscious, somewhere our ancestors have encountered large lizard-type things. And so when we daydream about monsters or want to come up with a monster for our story, we think of a dragon, which is something similar to what our ancestors experienced. Now again, this is wrong. Maybe Carl Jung's thinking about dinosaurs here, but human beings never encountered dinosaurs. Maybe our ancestors that were not human beings, but again, this is not how memories work. This is a weird idea. I'm just explaining it to you. Another good example of this is if we look at religions across many different societies, across a wide different array of societies. When religion starts up, there is a mother earth goddess. Now, across many different societies, the earth is associated as being a female. And there is a male sky god, and we can see these in cultures in South America, we can see these in cultures in Africa, we can see these in cultures in Europe and Asia. Anytime religion springs up, there seems to be a mother earth goddess and a father sky god. And via their interactions with one another, it populates the world in somehow. So we see these ideas appear in religion again and again and again. So again, according to Carl Jung, evidence of the collective unconscious, we've experienced something, our ancestors have experienced something, and so we have that information deep within our unconscious. Weird idea, I know. But again, that is Carl Jung's ideas. Like I said, not very relevant for psychology, but we see it as the plot in some movies, and we see it in the plot in some video games. So if you were familiar with the Assassin's Creed series of video games, it's based off of Carl Jung's ideas. In fact, a big machine in that game, if memory serves, is called the Animus, which is something that we'll talk a little bit later on associated with Carl Jung's theory. All right. What's personality like for Carl Jung? So Carl Jung, we have all of these primitive mental structures in our collective unconscious that lead us to behave in certain ways. And he calls these things archetypes. Okay, these archetypes are primitive mental structures. We have archetypes for things like the trickster, the old man, the god, the hero. We have these ideas of what this kind of person would be like. And these different archetypes exist in the collective unconscious and sometimes lead us to behave in certain ways. All right, and there's tons of different archetypes. So unlike Freud's id, the ego, and the superego, and all of these are interacting with one another, for Carl Jung, there's many, many different archetypes, and these archetypes sometimes will take control of our personality, sometimes lead us to behave and act and in certain ways. All right, so those are archetypes. Then we look at the persona. Okay, persona is an archetype. The persona is distinct from our self. It's the self that we want other people to see. Okay, it's the idealized version of ourselves that we want other people to see. So it's who we project ourselves to be. So maybe we are an average person, maybe like a Clark Kent, but we want to project a version of ourselves that is better. So this is our persona. You might act differently when you are at home alone compared to when you are out in public. Maybe how you act in public is your persona. It's the part of yourself that you would prefer people to see. We can contrast the persona with the shadow. The shadow is the archetype. It's the elements of ourself that we don't want others to see. It's the elements of our personality that we are ashamed of, that we don't want other people to see. So we would like to act like we are really good human beings, that we never do anything wrong, but sometimes we say dumb things, sometimes we get aggressive, sometimes we lie. These are the aspects of our personality that we don't like, that we don't want others people to see. This is the shadow. We can think of in the old story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde represents the elements of Dr. Jekyll's personality that are more basic, that are more base, that are animalistic, that everybody has this element to their personality, but with this potion, Dr. Jekyll releases this bit of his personality, that of Mr. Hyde. Again, Carl Jung, a very religious, very spiritual individual, he represents the snake from the Garden of Eden, maybe is representing the elements of our shadow. And in old school Star Trek, there was evil versions of the character, and for whatever reason, to make something evil, they decided to just give them some facial hair. So here is the evil version of Spock. So the negative aspect of Spock's personality, the shadow, according to Carl Jung. Now, you have some female ancestors and you have some male ancestors. So you have both masculine and feminine qualities to you, according to Carl Jung, because again, you have both male and female ancestors. So the anima is the unconscious female qualities that are present in men that might lead a male individual to act in a more feminine way, according to Carl Jung. And the animus is the unconscious masculine elements for a woman that are due to her male relatives, her male ancestors. All right, so this is another element, it's another archetype that leads people to behave in a certain way that deals with masculinity and femininity. All right, so it leads maybe girls to behave in more masculine ways, the animus, and maybe the anima leads men to behave in more feminine ways. All right. For Carl Jung, the important element, the sum total of all of these different archetypes, the sum total of our personality is referred to the self, which consists of the conscious part of our personality, which Carl Jung uses the term ego, similar to Freud, and all of the unconscious information part of our personality, all of the other archetypes. In the sum total of that is the self. For Carl Jung, the major motivating force for human beings is to truly discover who you are via a process called individuation. So we go from knowing a little bit of ourself, which is our ego, the conscious elements of ourself, via a long process of discovering who we are, and we learn the sum total of our personality, which is the self. Carl Jung, to explain his theory, would draw this little dot and a circle around it. The dot represents the ego. When we are born, when we are first on the road of self-discovery, this is what we are aware of. We're aware of the ego. But once we learn who we truly are, that is the self. It's the sum total of personality, the ego, plus all of the different elements of the unconscious. All right, a way to explain this, Carl Jung, again, a spiritual individual, he would rely on mandalas from Buddhism. So this is a mandala. In certain forms of Buddhism, you would meditate upon the mandala. This is a very, this one I believe is a Tibetan sand painting. I don't know if you've seen Tibetan monks do sand paintings like this, but it's quite both peaceful and amazing at the same time. The mandala, according to Carl Jung, represents the self. Maybe we have the ego in the middle. We have all of these different areas of personality out here, and the sum total of it is the self. There are many different pictures, kind of like the iceberg one for Sigmund Freud, to try to explain Carl Jung's theory, but all of these are bad because Carl Jung's theory has changed again and again and again throughout the course of his writings. So here's one example that I have here. We have the elements of the personality that we show the outside world. We have elements of the personality that we only have on the inside, so maybe more likely to be in our unconscious. So here's one example of that. But again, very difficult to really conceptualize what Carl Jung is talking about when we have his theory of personality. Freud, remember, the major motivating force for human beings was sex. It was to deal with this pleasurable energy, this libido. All right, that was the major motivating force for human personality. Now, Carl Jung has a similar drive. He boils down all of motivation into the drive of individuation. Individuation is the process of self-discovery. It is changing your psychological universe, changing your idea of your personality from the ego, just what you're consciously aware of, to the self, the sum total of your personality. All right, and Carl Jung thought that all human beings go through a hero's journey, a process of self-discovery that's similar to a lot of ancient myths, like the myth of the Odyssey, for instance, with Odysseus. So first you go, you have a guardian, you have a mentor, and you go through this long process where there's helpers and there's despair, and you're eventually transformed, and eventually you come back around and discover who you are. All right, but again, this is not a class on mythology. This is a class on psychology. So I'm just going to briefly go over what that hero's journey is. So the process of self-discovery, the process of individuation, is the major motivating force for Carl Jung. One thing that I want to mention is if we're talking specifically about Carl Jung's version of psychology, we call it analytical psychology. All right, analytic psychology, if someone says that, they mean Carl Jung's theories. Another term that's important to talk about for Carl Jung's ideas is synchronicity. Synchronicity. Words are difficult. Synchronicity, think of this as kind of like deja vu. So these are meaningful coincidences that occur in life that there doesn't seem to be a causal reason for why this thing occurred. Carl Jung thinks that these experiences are evidence of the collective unconscious. So a good example of this is Carl Jung is trying to treat a patient who's being very resistant to the psychotherapy. So Carl Jung says, okay, well, let's go in a different direction. Tell me about the dream that you had last night. The person talks about a dream in which they have a golden brooch, a golden piece of jewelry that is in the shape of a beetle. And so all of a sudden, Carl Jung hears a knocking at the window, and he opens up the window, and lo and behold, there is a beetle. And he shows the beetle to the patient, and the patient's like, whoa, how did that happen? And the patient became a whole lot less resistant to psychotherapy. Again, this is very mystical in nature, Carl Jung's theory of personality, Carl Jung's ideas within psychology. So there we go. All right. Everything that we talked about so far has really made more of an impression into anthropology, into mythology, and not really within psychology. You don't really see people talking about collective unconscious, the collective unconscious nowadays. Now, one element of Carl Jung's theory of personality that has made it into the public is his ideas of differences in attitudes and differences of ego functions. So Carl Jung's the first person to really, within psychology, to really make the distinction between extroversion and introversion. right? Extroverts versus introverts. This is a difference in attitudes according to Carl Jung. Some people, but he thinks of extroversion a little bit differently compared to how we think about it today within personality psychology. For Carl Jung, it's all about how do you receive your psychic energy. Do you receive your psychic energy by looking outside of yourself, by looking out towards the world, or do you receive your psychic energy by looking inside yourself, by spending time alone? All right, so are you more influenced by the outside world, all right, and you gain psychic energy from the outside world, or do you gain it from within? All right, so to think about it as kind of like recharging your battery. As a human being, do you recharge your battery by being around other people in social events, or by being by yourself? This doesn't necessarily mean that people that are introverted don't enjoy being around other people. It's just to recharge their psychic battery, whatever the heck that means. They would prefer to be by themselves. All right, so that's extroversion versus introversion. But Carl Jung has come up with this idea of ego functions, that people differ in how they interpret the world around them. All right, they differ in how they make their decisions. They differ in how they gain information to make their decisions. And Carl Jung argued that there were 4 types of ego functions, 2 pairs. All right, the first pair is intuition versus sensation. So intuition versus sensation. This has to do with how do people go about collecting data for their decision making. Do they want to look at the evidence? This is sensing. They want to look at the data. They want to see the data. They want to hear about things. All right, do they want to experience it? Or do they prefer to kind of rely on impressions? All right, do they not really want to look at the data, but kind of have a gut reaction to things? So intuition versus sensation, having to do with how someone gathers information. The other pair of ego functions, so intuition versus sensation. A good way of kind of distinguishing intuition versus sensation. Sensation is similar to inductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, we go from specific instances, all of this experimental data, and we end up creating a theory by generalizing this. This is sensing, all right? Think of inductive reasoning similar to sensing. We have all of these experiments, we have all of these different data points, and we come up with a theory. That's inductive reasoning, that's similar to sensing. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, this is where we already have a theory, we already have an idea of what's going on, and we make certain predictions about what's going to occur in the real world. This is similar to intuition. All right. The other pair of ego functions, according to Carl Jung, is thinking versus feeling. This has to do with how do we actually make a decision. Thinking, this is using logic. All right, this is thinking things through, making a list of the pros and cons. All right, we want to be logically consistent for thinking. Whereas feeling, we are making decisions based off of our feelings, based off of our heart, based off of how other people react to it. So we have this cute little cartoon down here. How do we make a decision? We have the thinker that is listing the pros and the cons of what decision to make, whereas the feeler is wanting to make a decision because it's important to them or it would make other people feel better. Even if it's not logically consistent, the feeler is going to make a decision to make other people happy. Good way of describing this is, does someone make a decision with their head or in their brain, or does someone make a decision with their heart? Okay, thinking versus feeling. My mind's telling me no, but my body is telling me yes, right? Oh, R. Kelly, horrible individual, but he's talking about the kind of the conflict between making decisions thinking, using this thinking ego function, or does he use decisions based off of feeling? Okay, that ego function. Now, extroversion, introversion, intuition, sensing, thinking versus feeling. This should seem familiar to some of you. This should seem familiar to you in that these are some of the things that are discussed with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And you're right, and that's what we're going to move on. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is based off of Carl Jung's theories. All right. The last pair of ego functions was not created by Carl Jung, but was created by Myers and Briggs when they created the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So we have judging versus perceiving. An individual that is judging is someone that is going to prepare for what's going to occur in the future. So they're going to plan ahead. They're not going to fly by the seat of their pants. Someone that is a perceiver is going to wait and react to something. So if we have a paper that's coming up in a class, for instance, the judger is going to work on it early on, get it done, and not worry about it near the end of the class, whereas someone that's a perceiver is not going to think about that project, not experience any stress until the week or a couple days beforehand, then all of a sudden is going to get really freaked out because the project is coming up quickly. All right, so that's judging versus perceiving. All right, so let's move on and talk about the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator itself. So the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator was a test created by the mother-daughter team of Catherine Briggs, who was the mother, and her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers. All right, they decided, because of Carl Jung's theory, they wanted to come up with a way to measure these things, these individual differences in someone's personality, which is a kind of cute way of doing a test like this. They meant it to be a process of self-discovery. So not to make a decision about what job someone should have, not to make a decision about how someone should administer therapy to these individuals, but just as a cool process of self-discovery, which again is in line with Carl Jung's theory of personality. All right, so they decide to distinguish people into one of 16 different types based off of whether or not they are extrovert versus an introvert, whether or not they're intuitive versus sensing, whether or not they are thinking versus feeling, or whether or not they are judging versus perceiving. So you're either one or the other according to this test. So this is a personality type and not a trait. Notice that people distinguish, they're either this one or they're that one. There's nobody in the middle. Right? You don't differ quantitatively in how much of this trait you actually have. So there are types. So you can be one of 16 different types. For instance, you could be an extrovert who is intuitive, who is feeling, who is perceiving. And that's an example of one type according to the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. All right. So the test was originally designed to be used just as a process of self-discovery. And yet, that's not what happened to the test. The test became very popular, and all of a sudden, people started using it for job selection. They started using it for promotion in a particular job. They started using it to help counseling. They started using it to predict who you should date. This test has been used in a wide variety of settings that in no way the test was originally designed to do. So why is this test so popular? All right, I'm going to make 2 points of its popularity. One, I think it's popular because it's easy to explain someone's personality in terms of types. You're an extrovert, you're an introvert, right? It's hard to explain somebody if you're in the 60th percentile of extroversion, right? That's hard to explain to somebody else. Whereas extrovert, introvert, it's easy to see that distinction. So it's easy to explain. Number 2, the test doesn't put any judgment about what personality type is better to have. So extrovert, introvert, well, one has some advantages, the other has some other advantages. Thinking versus feeling, we can see advantages to one versus advantages to the other. People like personality tests where there is no bad outcome. All right, no bad outcome. We talk about the positive qualities of your personality. Yay, everybody's happy and they want to share that personality test. All right, think of the Enneagram. If you know the Enneagram, or if you've taken the Enneagram, none of those types are bad. They're all described in very positive light. Again, people like this personality kind of test if there's no bad personality trait. But if you take a personality test and it says, hey, buddy, you're lazy and you're high in anxiety, guess what? You're not going to like that much. You're not going to enjoy putting that on your Facebook feed. All right. So a lot of the more popular personality tests don't have any negative personality types. All right. So they're marketed in a certain way so that everybody goes home happy. Another thing about this test is it is all forced choice. You pick one of the answers or the other one. So let me give you an example of this. So are you practical, realistic, and experiential, or imaginative and theoretical? What happens if you're both? What happens if you're in the middle? There is no spot for you to make that distinction, right? You had to pick one of those. It's a forced choice. So again, we can see that this is a type, not a trait. But people actually do fall in the middle here. In fact, the vast majority of people might fall in the middle of this kind of dichotomy. Another thing here. For the test, I'm likely to give you example items like this, or I might describe someone's personality, and I want you to tell me what is their Myers-Briggs type, or this question measures this. So what does this question measure? So experiential. So someone is actually seeing something. So this would be sensing. Imaginative and theoretical. This is someone that's intuiting something. This is sensing versus intuition. That's what this test item is trying to get at. All right, how about the next one? Do you like to plan ahead or do you go along with the flow? Okay, first thing, how about if you're in the middle, right? There's plenty of people that are in the middle here, and yet there's no answer choice for you. You have to make a distinction. This is measuring judging versus perceiving. Do you like to plan ahead? That is judging. Do you go along with the flow? That is perceiving. All right, so there we go. This is measuring judging versus perceiving. So the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator has, again, very, very popular. It's associated with a wide variety of things. One thing is the kind of job that you might enjoy doing, the kind of job that you would be successful at. So for instance, if you're ISTJ, which is typically what I get when I take this test, again, that is introvert, sensing, thinking, judging. You might be a good accountant, computer programmer, dentist, doctor, lawyer, scientist. Ooh, that's what I am, so yay me. I don't want you to know this stuff. Again, this really isn't based off of any empirical evidence as much as it is just kind of a cute thing that you can look at when you get your Myers-Briggs type. Again, personality test, very popular. People enjoy looking at this kind of stuff, even if there's no data to support it. All right. How about if you were an ISFP? Well, then you are the artist, and you might be a good forest ranger or a psychologist. And of course, here I mean clinical psychologist, which makes me mad. They're not making, they're not being specific with it. All right. And then we've got some other examples here of maybe some professions that you might be good at, depending on your Myers-Briggs type. Again, I don't want you to know this. I just want you to know that this is popular. All right, we can see all kinds of media, popular media, and maybe we can learn something about other people and their Myers-Briggs types. There's plenty of other human beings that go around and look at Star Wars and Disney princesses and all sorts of things and try to come up with what are those individuals' Myers-Briggs types according to the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And a lot of people really, really love this. Again, if we look at my Myers-Briggs type, oh, I get Mulan and I don't get Belle from Beauty and the Beast, so boo. All right, so very, very popular. A lot of people really like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. But, so let's talk about how it's scored before I get to some criticisms of it. So there are a bunch of questions that are looking at extroversion and versus introversion. And you add up how many of the extroversion scores people have. You add up how many sensing the person has versus intuition and sensing, thinking versus thinking and feeling. So you add up how many they get of each of these categories, and then you have a cutoff score. You find the median, the middlemost score, and you say everybody that's to the left of that cutoff, everybody that scores lower than that, is an introvert. And everybody that scores higher than that cutoff is an extrovert. All right, that is the distinction that they make. Now, that is not the best distinction to make here, right? There's some problems with that, okay? So the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is arguing that the way that personality truly functions here is that there are introverts and then there are extroverts. There's people that are intuitive versus sensing, and there's nobody in the middle. The test has the implicit idea that there are two categories of people and nobody exists in the middle. When in actuality, we know that this is not the case, okay, for a personality trait. In fact, if we even look at those questions on the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, we see that the scores are normally distributed. So the theory that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is based off of is just wrong. It's wrong. People differ in not qualitatively, but they differ quantitatively in how much of the trait that they have. So the fact that we're taking a continuous trait and we're forcing it into this category or that category, we're forcing it into a typology, has a lot of major problems that are going to bite this test in the butt. So we're going to talk about some of the major problems of this test. Okay, the first major problem here is that the standardization sample, the sample that we originally used to find out what those cutoff scores are, is going to have a huge impact on how people are placed according to their type. Okay, so if we take one sample, and we take one standardization sample, and this is the cutoff point, and we take another standardization sample, and the cutoff point is a little bit over here. Now, everybody that was in the middle there has changed completely. They were an extrovert, now they're an introvert. They were judging, now they're perceiving. So small differences in the standardization sample is going to have a large impact on the Myers-Briggs type that somebody's personality is assigned. All right. The reliability of the test is abysmal. I have abyssal here. I don't know why I have that, but the reliability is really, really, really bad. All right. Remember, we are judging tests based off of whether or not they're consistent. Personality should be consistent. Your personality today should be similar to your personality a week from now, and yet the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator does not have this consistency. Across a 5-week period of time, 50% of test takers, that's half, receive a different classification on at least one of the different categories. So extroversion versus introvert, thinking versus feeling, at least one of those has changed over the course of 5 weeks. So the reliability of this test is really bad. If the reliability of the test is very bad, that means the validity of this test is going to be bad. Okay, because it's not reliable, it cannot be psychometrically valid. All right, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator assumes that there's huge differences between categories. So extroverts are extremely different than introverts, thinkers are extremely different than feelers, and that there are no differences within category. I'm going to have to get my handy drawing tool to explain what I mean here. Okay, so assume that we have here a normal distribution. Okay, here is our normal distribution. This is frequency on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have some trait. Let's say that this is maybe thinking. Okay. The further you are on the left, the more feeling you are. The further that you're on the right, the more thinking that you are. Okay, so we're going to divide this smack dab in the middle. Okay, and if you're on the left, you're feeling. And if you're on the right, you are thinking. Okay, so let's say, boom, okay. We have a person that scores right here, just a little bit above it. And we have another person that scores a little bit less than the cutoff. Now we're making the assumption with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator that there's a huge personality difference between these two individuals, the feeler and the thinker, when in actuality, the difference between them is relatively mild. All right? So we're assuming a large difference between thinkers and feelers, where in actuality, they might only differ a little bit on that trait. They might only differ a little bit actually on the test, but we're making a huge distinction between these individuals. All right, let's take another situation. We're making, for instance, the judgment that somebody that scores right here and that somebody that scores, let's say, right here, these are both thinkers. All right, these are both thinkers. We're making the assumption that there's no personality differences between the two of them, when in actuality, there's a huge personality difference between the two of them. All right, we're making the assumption that there's no within category distinctions, that both of these are thinkers, so they're not different in this personality dimension, when in fact, they are extremely different from one another. But the test doesn't show that, because the test is looking at types and not personality traits. All right. Last one, how about the predictive validity of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator? Does it predict all these different things that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is used for? You know, who would succeed at their job? Are they a good fit for this job? Should they be promoted? Should we hire this person? That was earlier. What kind of clinical therapy we should use? Does the test do a good job of predicting real dimensions in personality? And the answer is no, no, no. Okay. The test is not reliable. It's not going to predict a dang thing. All right. So this is a meta-analysis review paper that's been conducted on the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, and this researcher has suggested that using the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator to select employees, to assign employees to work groups or assignments, or for any other form of employment evaluation is just not justified, for the simple reason that there's no available data to recommend such decisions. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, if you're using the typology, doesn't predict a dang thing. And yet it's a famous test, and yet people spend lots of dollars to use this test, and yet many companies still might use this test to look at personality. And this is problematic. Same thing with the Enneagram. All right, the Enneagram puts people into types when there's probably some real dimensions in personality that differ between these people. And the profile for the Enneagram might be different. If you are type 5, you might have different other types scores. We're not going to talk a ton about the Enneagram, but those of you that are interested in it, I thought I'd just mention that. The reliability of those tests for typologies are just really, really bad, and they don't end up predicting anything. Even though they might measure some true dimensions in personality, so for instance, extroversion versus introversion is a true dimension in personality. It's something that actually varies. But if you look at it as a type instead of a trait, you're going to find that it doesn't relate to anything. All right. I will stop the rant and video right now, just to give you guys a little bit of a break, give me a little bit of a break, and we will start back up with Alfred Adler and the other psychodynamic theorists in the next video. Thank you.